Hey everyone, welcome to this video in the How To Do Recon series. Today we're talking about API enumeration. I know a ton of you have been super interested to learn more about this, and I've been really interested to share it. Last week I talked about the types of bugs you find in API, and this week we're going to talk about how to enumerate an API. So I hope by watching the 4 previous videos I've done on APIs, which is the API one, the finding your first bug API, the second one is Firefox containers, next one is API top 10, and this week API enumeration. So this week we're going to be talking about, you found an API, how do you do recon on the API? How do you find bugs there? How do you find those endpoints that nobody else knows about? How do you find those parameters, the secret parameters? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is going to be a long one, so get comfortable because there's 48 slides to get through and like 4 demos. So really hope that you find this super interesting. I'm going to put some timestamps down below because I think a few people might just want to watch the demos and go through each stage. So this video is also sponsored by Integrity. In case you missed all of the other videos with this news, Integrity have very kindly offered sponsored videos on my channel. If you're unaware of them, they're a bug bounty platform like HackerOne and BugCrowd. They focus more on European customers rather than global customers. They're a smaller platform for sure, but they actually have a lot more different programs, and because of their kind of small, they're actually really active on social media, always replying and interacting with hackers, which is really great. Even though they've got like the smaller pool, they actually have quite a wide range of targets, which you don't necessarily find on other platforms, especially considering the amount of active hackers is a lot smaller. There's some really good opportunities there to hack on some unique targets that maybe nobody else is hacking on. They run XSS challenges, so in case you're not quite ready to do the bug hunting side of things, actually you can still participate and win prizes, which is great. But you know me, I'm all about community. It's a really big deal to me, and actually I'm really happy to work with them because they are giving back to the community, not just in sponsoring my videos, but actively doing Q&As on Twitter, or sponsoring Pentesterland's newsletter, doing a bunch of stuff where they're actively engaging with the community. I really don't have taking a sponsor lightly, so I really want you to know that advertising on my channel are really carefully considered, and I really did think about this before I just said yes. And if you're not already a member, you can sign up with the link on the screen, which is go.integrity.com/Katie, go.integrity.com/Katie. And I've already heard from people who've signed up and they found their first bug, or they're finding bugs on Integrity, and that just makes me so happy. I love hearing news about people finding their first bug. I really want to raise you guys up if you find your first bug, and I'm so happy that people have found it on Integrity, and really that helps my channel, it helps them. It's really great. A sponsorship like this really helps me invest in my channel. So one of the big things I bought was an actual microphone. And now my audio sounds much better. So I really hope you give them a lot of love from my community, because without them, you'd still be listening in USB microphone era, or even worse, inbuilt laptop microphone era. So I promote them because I think they provide something great. Again, go.integrity.com/Katie, link in the description, etc., etc. So I really hope that you try out the platform. If you find your first bug on Integrity, do let me know. So let's get on with the video. There is a prerequisite video for this video, which is the finding your first bug, finding bugs in using APIs. Before you watch this video, you really need to know things like what an API is, what they look like and how to spot them, and how they're used. The video last week, which was Katie Explains Top 10 API Bugs from OWASP. Before you watch the video, you should really watch this one, because it will tell you more about what bugs exist in APIs, what the sign of these bugs are, and vaguely how to find them. Especially when we start talking about recon not just as a thing one does to hack, but instead a thing one does to enable them to find bugs. So that kind of difference in mentality, that recon is a script you run and it just works and you're fantastic, to recon as this natural stage that happens when you do when you're finding bugs, and enables you to find bugs rather than just finding the bugs for you. But But in case you're lazy, let's do a quick recap. So APIs are services that provide a machine-friendly way to communicate between a server and a desktop / web / mobile app. An example is shown on the other side, get / employee / one. It usually returns JSON, which is what you're seeing here. JSON, if you really want to learn API hacking, is really important to understand. You don't need to be fluent in it because it's quite readable, even though it's designed for a machine, but it is important to know how objects work and stuff like that so you can read it. They're APIs are predictable and follow a structure, and that's really important for dealing with like a machine, but also for developers so they can check what they've done off. There's many types of APIs. There's RESTful APIs, there's GraphQL, there's SOAP if you live in 10 years ago, 2010, maybe even earlier actually, 2002. Not 10 used anymore. We're really going to just be focusing on RESTful APIs this video. And that's because GraphQL is actually really easy to enumerate. You can run one command and enumerate all the endpoints. Although next week I'll be talking more about GraphQL and more about hacking GraphQL. So if you aren't dealing with RESTful API endpoints, you've got that. SOAP is a lot rarer nowadays. You don't really see it as often. You do see it, especially in legacy applications, but it's a lot more common to have RESTful APIs. So I'm just going to focus on that, but be aware that these other APIs exist. One thing about RESTful APIs is they have this predictable structure and are quite easily spotted, which means it's great to demo these techniques, right? Because we can quite easily see here that we have a create, a read, update, delete endpoint. So we can quite easily map our knowledge to those. Some endpoints are kind of custom. You'll see here that actually there can be several forms of the update endpoint and several forms of the delete endpoint, but we'll talk all about that in a minute. So the kind of summary, what is this video about? 1, the APIs are used to power many types of apps. 2, we're only going to focus on RESTful APIs. And 3, we're going to be reading JSON. So these are the things you kind of need to know before you can engage properly with this video. So now that's out of the way, let's talk about API enumeration. What is it? What are our goals / methods / destinations, and why do we need to do it? So last episode I should say, I talked about this idea of goal, method, destination. Now we shouldn't just be running Recon as a script that we just run and we don't think about it necessarily. We should have a general idea of why we're doing it. So our goal is what we want to achieve with running a script or doing a Recon activity. Our method is the tools and techniques that we can use or we're going to use, and the destination is what the output is and how we're actually going to use it. Now, a lot of the time with Recon especially, you end up with a bunch of files that you can't really use. And yes, there are a lot of tips, like people can grep all the files and stuff like that, but I really want to take you guys through these basic steps. So that's kind of what I talked about before. So let's map this back to API enumeration. So what's the goal for API enumeration? We really are focusing on increasing our attack surface. Fundamentally, we want to know everything that exists on a web app. Specifically, we want to find endpoints that wouldn't normally be available. So finding those endpoints that aren't necessarily public can be great for hacking and really, really useful. Or endpoints that require a specific set of actions, like complex business logic, for example. They can be really great to hack just because they have a lot of different steps, and the different steps can be vulnerable to different bugs. Now, what we really want to do is create like a treasure map. We want to map out the API, work out, prioritize which are the most important ones, know what bugs exist, and know actually, okay, so my API endpoint has this kind of feature. These are the bugs that I want to focus on for that. And that will really help us to kind of hack smart, not just hit a bunch of endpoints with a bunch of different bugs. So what's our method? We want to primarily discover new URLs given a certain pattern. If we know that API/1/users exists, we want to know whether or not posts exist as well. We want to be able to kind of discover what exists. And we also want to know what parameters API endpoints might take. Because just because there's like this, using RESTful, there's this kind of accepted form, doesn't mean that some things might not surprise us. So there's two main approaches to do this. We have automated tools and we have manual testing. Now we use both. We don't just use manual automated tools. We don't just use manual testing. For automated tools, we're looking at brute forcing, we're looking at parameter forcing, and the tools we're going to specifically look at today are going to be Burp Intruder, Ffuf, Ffuf, and Arjun. And on the other side of manual testing, we're going to be looking at developer documentation and just have a poke at an application, you know, press buttons, what can we do, what can't we do, when is the API actually appearing. So let's go to our specific tools, because that's going to be the primary focus of this video, because there are things I think people get really worried about that they don't think they can use. But actually they're quite simple. And I'm going to go through Burp Intruder, then I'm going to go through Ffuf, and then I'm going to go through Arjun. So Burp Intruder and Ffuf do the same thing, which is both brute forcing, and Arjun is for discovering parameters. So there's two different use cases. So that's our kind of our goal and our method. Let's talk about our destination. We really want a list of URLs we can load up into Burp. Even better if they can go straight into Burp. And I'm going to show you how to do that. We really only want the valid URLs. Our goal is really a list. It might be good to see what valid endpoint returns, so you can check for things like sensitive data exposure or information disclosure. But actually, we're also looking for a bunch of other bugs. You know, once we've got a good chunk of the API in Burp, we can see it. We're then looking out for any API endpoint running a lot of info, IDs, internal APIs, reflected input, all of these that make up the kind of bug hunting for API. So if you want to learn more about that, I have an entire video now on the top 10 API bugs where I go over each one and show what the signs are. One thing I will say, especially as we go into API enumeration specifically and recon, is that it's really important to learn the signs of some bugs. Like, you want to find, okay, this is the bug and this is where it exists, not just I'm going to try a bunch of different payloads and see if it works. If you need to just, you know, look at the basics, you can then go on and say, okay, I now need to do more research to find out exactly what to do. That's great. Right, so let's get started. The first steps for API enumeration. The first thing to really note is that structure can vary with APIs. We spoke about it kind of before when I was introducing it, but actually the kind of RESTful API structure often kind of tends to be a bit weird. And that's usually because put and delete aren't implemented in web browsers. You can call them via things like Postman, but you can't really call them using other, or Burp specifically as well. Now, often instead you'll see kind of custom endpoints that use post or get. I've included here, I've highlighted the ones that the update one you tend to see, which is post/1, which is our ID, and you'll often see something there that's like edit or new. Sometimes you'll get like a little Boolean value, for example. Often they're going to be custom, so that doesn't necessarily mean once you see it in one that you can really go to the next, like another API. You really need to tailor your approach. And the first thing you should do before you jump straight in with tools is assess the API structure. It's really important to know what endpoints might look like and how they might be loading up data, rather than going straight into, okay, so we need to get every resource name, for example. So how you tailor it is you really have to hit the API manually, right, to gather the endpoints. Figure out which one is the resource name, what's changing. So on this example here, we can see API user 6. This is quite clearly a resource name there. And what we might do is we might say, okay, this is our request. This is pretty much useless. And actually we're not sending any other information. So when we go up here, which will be our response, what does that get back, right? What do we see? We would then try and find, okay, can we edit this? Can we delete this? And if we can find the kind of CRUD functionality, create, read, update, delete, it doesn't have to be on the same like resource. We just need to get an idea of what the structure looks like. One really good way of hacking is actually when you see an endpoint that deviates from the structure. That can often be a sign of vulnerabilities. So really, we also want to learn what the functionality is for most of the endpoints and resources, because that's really important when we actually come to write up our report, because otherwise we're going to not be able to understand and explain what the app actually does. So this is really an important first step. Without this step, we don't really have anything to hack. We can't just assume what to recon. We need to know for sure how we should spend our efforts and energy. There's no point doing it. We also really need to know how the API works. What endpoints for each resource do. What impact does our bug have? It's really important to actually tie that all back to the business logic, to what an application does. Because we can't just tell someone there's an IDOR there. We need to go into detail. We need to be able to tell them, look, this is really scary because you can change someone's password without them knowing by just using this API endpoint. Right, so now that's out of the way, let's talk about the easiest API recon you can do: read the docs, which is often given to programming when people ask for help and they go, read the docs. And you know what the easiest way to get information out of API is? Just ask. APIs are designed often for developers, especially external developers, so some targets will proudly tell you what you need to include. So this is an API endpoint from Twitter. As you can see, this is telling us the resource we need. Then it's telling us the information here. Is it rate limited? How much is the rate limited? Does it require authentication? And then down here it tells us the objects it needs inside of it, and further down on this it tells you default values as well. So this documentation can give you every endpoint, the parameters you need, and example requests, example responses. Now here's one where we can now see the example request and the example responses. Here, this is our request and this is our response. And actually they're telling us a lot about how to interact with our API. We've got what keys we need here. Got some more keys over here and here. And then we also have like the specific stuff here, like the values that you can use. And it tells us the response as well. So it can be really great just to read the documentation to understand it. Here are some targets that produce some documentation: Twitter, Facebook, Yahoo. And plenty of smaller targets who might work quite well with developers will also have API documentation. If you're dealing with something where people want developers to be interacting with it or are providing some kind of developer service, you will see API documentation that is designed for developers and that has a lot of information. Again, on this is a tool called Swagger. So this is a visualization tool for APIs. It's usually used for development purposes. It can sometimes be used as kind of documentation. And I guess it's a form of documentation, really. But it just automatically will find, using some commands in the code, what API endpoints are and what they do. And its URL is usually this one here, which is /__swagger. And this one, again, it tells us every API endpoint. It tells us what parameters are. And it tells us what the response looks like. So there's quite a lot of information here that we can use to hack, right? So, okay, we found some documentation. How do we hack it? Really, once we read the docs, we know what all the API endpoints are. We should be testing them, right? We're really still looking for those top 10 bugs. So we're hitting the endpoint, see what the responses are, testing for additional parameters. Whatever it is, you're still doing the same thing, okay? Some endpoints are going to be really simple because they are documented. Now, the problem with a lot of API endpoints is that they're not documented and you have to enumerate them. Now, we spoke before about having API-1-users-1. API version 1-users-1. And really, when we look at word lists and API word lists, we're looking at where to replace that resource name to find more resources. So I think it'll become more clear as we kind of talk about it. So what's a word list? It's a list of words. As we'll see, there are different types of word lists for different kind of like stuff. Sometimes you'll see word lists that are designed for finding debug files or like files with certain something.php, whatever. We want to specifically focus on API names for fuzzing APIs. These are our API resources. We want to do our, we've got our endpoint is API dash whatever dash 1. We want to try and brute force that, because that is the thing that's going to change. From our earlier research, we can go, okay, this is changing, so this is where I'm going to edit. So if we see posts, we're then looking at users or replies. And there's two things you should be doing about word lists. And this is in general, not just for API hacking, is that you should really be making your own. API endpoints can be so specific to a target. It really can. And what the target does. And these kind of generic lists don't always work. So you should really be aware of creating your own word list, whether that's gathering the APIs that you've seen in the wild, or whether it's doing some other activity. So when do we use word lists? We use them 2 times in API Recon specifically, when we want to enumerate resources to find new endpoints and we want to enumerate parameters to find additional functionality. These require 2 different word lists because they are 2 different functions. Consider you are dealing with something like a specific endpoint that allows you to change your username. You want to test, when you test that, the parameters, username, password, email, which won't exist as resources. So what do they kind of look like? So this is what we're looking at here is, we've got admin, we've got balance, amount, contract, and we can kind of imagine these as being our like little API endpoints. So this would be our API-1/contact/1. And I mean, there's 82 lines of these, right? There's a lot of lines of, there's 109 lines of this one. These are a lot of lines of potential, and it doesn't necessarily mean, if we're not dealing with something that deals with contracts, that's not going to work. If we don't have something dealing with money, we're not going to see an amount, balances, none of that. So there are these public word lists. We have seclist, which is the kind of big one. We have fuzzDB, and we have seclist raft words. So these ones here are specifically for APIs, and they're often like APIs seen in the wild. This one here is just a list of words. So when we're dealing with APIs and we just want a list of words, this is the one we use. If we want something more specific, we're looking at these 2. So let's talk about how to create custom word lists. API endpoints can be specific to a target, and especially as we're often enumerating resource names. Some might be really common, like user or users, but some are going to be really specific to your target. So let's talk about how to make them. So Nahamsek has a great video on creating word lists, although he's less focused on API specifically and looking at kind of other things, but this is a really bad screenshot, sorry. He's got, it's not necessarily for APIs, his video, but it has some really good advice. And I really like his idea of hitting up the previous things about target. So manual word list creation, I think informed might be a better term. Similar services might have documented APIs, you should check those. Use the Wayback Machine method from Nahamsek's videos, check on those. Make sure you've tried the good old press all the buttons and see what happens. And then you might want to try writing sensible words, What does the app say? What actions does it let you do? If you see things like edit profile, you're going to be thinking profile users. If you look at the second one, create a new post is kind of a direct command almost. So checking out post would be a good idea, or posts. This is really time consuming. You should try and use the automated methods whenever possible. But I highly recommend actually this method, hit all the buttons. You'd be surprised what you can find if you hit every single functionality an app can do. It's really useful. Okay, it's demo time. So I'm going to show you how to enumerate API endpoints using Ffuf and Burp Intruder. So let's go over Burp Intruder first. Okay, so we are back. So we're on SecList here, and the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to download. Actually, we'll just press raw because it's easier. Now, I am using in this video Burp Professional. You do not have to use Burp Professional. It just makes Intruder go quicker for the video. So don't worry about whether or not you need it. You don't need it. It's fine. Okay, so let's go and open Firefox. So this is my API. I made this. It's very good. And we can see already that it's some kind of university system. View your grades. A lovely GIF. And it's made by Armani. So immediately, we don't necessarily see anything here. We see a login functionality, but we don't see anything else. So there's nothing really there. But what we do see is we do see API here. So this is loading up Mr. Armani's name from the database, presumably. So we know there's an API here. Now we only know about the API users because there is no buttons to press. There is nothing, you can't press anything, it doesn't work. So we need to do some API enumeration. So we have our list here. Now this is from SecList and it's actions lowercase. Do we want actions actually? No, we want methods. Yes, we want methods, not actions. Objects. Okay, so we want to go to raw and copy them. And then we want to go back to Burp. Click on this, go to send to intruder. Now it's in intruder. We go to positions. Now you can see by default it puts the little simoleon signs here, but that's not what we want to mess with. We want to mess with this bit up here. There are things here like different types of attacks. You can just ignore that and keep it as it is. So we clear that and we change users up here. So that changes just that users. It doesn't change anything else. Now we could add even more by just putting that in here and we can clear it. And you know, maybe we want to add this and then we want to maybe enumerate over that later. Okay, so now we go to payloads, and since we've copied all of this, we just press paste. And there we go, it's in there, it's a list, it's done. And we'll do start attack. So this is why I'm using the premium version of Burp for this, because it goes a lot quicker. So immediately we're looking at status, because we're trying to find out what's hit. And as you can see, because our API is so specialist, actually this whole list hasn't worked for it. It doesn't, the only one that's worked is users. So we might need to be thinking, okay, we need a specialist list here. And again, we're looking here and you can see that employee hasn't hit, history, map, passwords. So we might do that. We might also want to go in here and clear it and go to this number here. Now, we can go in here and do kind of simple list, whatever, but we can also do other things. So we can do numbers and we can generate sequential numbers from 1 to say 20 in a step of 1, which gives us 20 requests. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So start attack again. And as we can see here, all of them have come back 200, but some of them are coming back with nothing inside. So this is where we might look at the length instead. So we know all of these 900 lengths are ones that don't exist. So it must only go up to 7, essentially. And we can see here that we've got something coming up in the responses. So we know that there's 7 users. Now let's go back to our initial problem, which is how do we know what endpoints exist? Now we can go back in here and we can go from API to objects uppercase. We can keep on trying these API Endpoints, we can try actions, we can try API seen in the wild. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of a size difference. So we'll have a go and we'll try this. And again, we want to clear that, put it under users instead. Go to payloads, payload 1, go up here, simple list, clear the list, paste the list, new list in, and done. And as we'll probably see, they won't really work because, yeah, most of it will be 404 errors. We can see whether or not anything comes up and leave that in the background. Okay, so evidently what we're going to need to do here is create our own list, essentially. So we might have a look. University, view your grades. Immediately, grades, right? We add grades, we add grade. We know that there's users, you know, what else universities have? Well, they have classes. Maybe they have professors, right? Universities, etc., etc. So we can build this kind of list, and this is time consuming, and believe you me, it is time consuming. But APIs can be so specialist that you just don't have a choice. Like this super long list, right, of APIs seen in the wild, we finished, there's no matches. None of them work because none of them are specific to our target. You know, guild bank item button on click, that's going to be really specific to whomever it is. You know, get material ID, again, really specific. Fusion Stone for their API. So just using these lists and these lists that are available is just not enough sometimes. So let's try our more custom list. So again, nothing's really changed, we've just replaced the list. And immediately we can see that we've got a 200 on grades and classes. And now we've learned more about the API. Now we know that this exists. Now what we can see here is that there's no response for this one, this classes. And we might do the same thing. We'll go here, send to intruder, and clear it, go to the 6, add, and just check that there isn't just like a number, right? It doesn't just need from 1 to 20, step 1, start attack, and bam, we can see that actually there are only 5 classes, which is why we're not getting a response for 6. So we've got theory and applications of turbulence, aerospace propulsion systems, and fluid mechanics. Okay, so now we know kind of how this is structured. We've also got grades. Now the response for grades here, we've got a number, comments, created at, updated at, uni class ID and user ID. So we can safely say, okay, there's users and there's classes. Makes sense, right? If we go in here, we're also seeing the same thing, you know, ID, name, description. We're seeing user ID. Now, we can then say there's some kind of link between user and, you know, class. Now, this is really important because if we didn't know that user existed, we would then be able to say, okay, there's users or users there. And this is what's really important sometimes when you're doing recon, is to kind of know what comes next. So we know that this one works. So let's just try and just copy it. It can be really useful to request stuff in the original session as well. And here we can see that it's returning something. And if we go here and we go here, it's also returning something. And that just helps get this stuff in Burp as well. Right, so we have an idea now of what our kind of our attack surface looks like. We know we have classes, grades, and users. What we don't really know is what we can do with them. And this is how you generally use Burp. I'm now going to show you the same thing, but in ffuf. So let's get that set up. Okay, so I think what's important before we sort of look at a demo of ffuf is really to talk about introducing it. So it's a tool written in Go, which is a very popular language now for doing bug bounty stuff because it's very, very quick. So I'm using Intruder on the paid version because it's a lot quicker for making videos, especially when you're dealing with stuff like 7,000 lines. But actually, if you don't have Burp Premium, ffuf can do a really good job of doing stuff very, very quickly. And it's actually not that more difficult to use. So let's have a look at it. This is what an ffuf command looks like. So we have this kind of dark blue area here. That's our word list. This is what we're going to fuzz. We then have U, and then we have the URL. And importantly in the URL, we have this. So this tells us what to fuzz. In, Burp, it's the kind of squiggly line, the simoleon. But in here, we just have the word fuzz in all caps. We then set it to some kind of output. And this is basically so we can look at it later in case we need to. Especially as a lot of people will have Burp. The free version, you can't save Burp. And this next one here is the HTTP proxy. So this will send all requests to Burp. So the important thing to really change is this part here, which is our URL and our API, and making sure fuzz goes in the right position. And again, we have to have a word list here. The word list can be anything really. It just has to be the same as like one word, then another word, then another word, that goes there. So let's give this a go and I'll show you what it looks like as we demo it. Okay, so we're back with the demo. We've got command prompt open. And let's have a look at our ffuf command. So this is what we're looking at. Whoops, didn't mean to send it. We have ffuf w wordlist wordlist.txt. Now let's create in my little folder here the word list we need. So we can download a word list, and to show you the speed here, I'm just going to use this one that really didn't work, but it's fine. It's fine. Command prompt and this and hit and paste and save. Done. So we've got a word list. We're sending it to the right API endpoint with our fuzz in there, and then we're also sending it to Burp. So let's have a look here in Burp's proxy settings what it's actually doing. So we can see it doing stuff, and look at that, it's doing tons of requests, and it's doing 150, 130, 140 requests a second, and we can see it go through Burp. And it won't really find anything because we know that none of these endpoints exist. But I thought I'd first show you the idea of how quick this is. Especially when you kind of don't have the full version of Burp, this can be a really great version of just getting stuff in. It's almost done now. So we know this word list doesn't really work. So here's what we can do. We'll go back and put grades, classes, I think those are the only two that worked in as well. So as Burp, as ffuf continues, we can see that it worked fine and it has an output of output.txt. So if we go in here and open output, we can see kind of what it ran and see that it didn't find anything. There's no real results. Again, reading JSON super helpful, the results are here. The rest of it is just information about what it was searching for. Okay, so let's run it with the new word list that we know works to see the difference. So here we can see it's working and it's able to pop those in the sitemap. So we can really get everything into Burp. And if you're not really comfortable using the command line yet, really getting everything into Burp can be a great way of just dealing with it and trying to understand it. we see here we've got the user agent of fuzz faster you full, so we know it came from FFUF, not from Burp. And you can see it's true for all of these where it's sending like limited headers. Cool, so that's how you use FFUF. There are a lot more options that you can do with the tool. When I've messed it up here, you've got whether you want custom headers, HTTP methods to use, the cookie data, post data, following redirects, recursion. This is a really basic version of how to do it, and a really basic command. And again, I'll leave it in the description so you can copy it, so you can have a go. When you did start to like deal with this, you'll kind of see how it works. I know it sounds a bit bizarre. Oh, I should show what output looks like when it actually works. Here we can see that our results here. We've got the URL and stuff like that. Sorry, it's fine. There are a lot of other options that we have, and as you become more confident with fuzzing, you'll then kind of be able to play with this a little bit more. It can be difficult at the moment to kind of break it down and be like, this is what I need to do. But there's some good help here, like whether or not you want to fuzz data and stuff like that. So really do practice, see what you can do with it. But that's how you use FFUF. I highly recommend as a beginner keeping it outputting to Burp as well as a file, just because I think it's easier to deal with. So, right, that's FFUF. Okay, so we've now found a bunch of API endpoints, but actually we need to know what data goes into them. That sounds like kind of obvious. So we have our API users, but we don't really know what we can do with it. Now, what's really important is that knowing that API structure will really help us approach this problem. Now, I'm going to be looking at one way, and I'm just going to be looking at the post for something. But actually, there's a lot you can do with this, so don't really think this is the only thing. So we're going to be using a tool called Arjun. I have forked this with a change to use Burp. You don't need to do that for reference. You don't need to use my version. You can use theirs because it's not helpful. I just wanted to do it to show it. So we're using this tool called Arjun. So how do we install it? I've created a Docker version here. You can see my gists to get the kind of Docker setup working. But normally you just install Python 3 and then install requests via pip, which is pip install requests. That's all you need to do. That is how you install it. If you do use Docker, there's a Docker version. I swap between different machines, so I have Docker versions of some things, just because then it makes it easier when you've got like 2 different versions of Python, and pip only installs on Python 2, but you've got Python 3 installed, so you need to install pip 3. Just if you want to use Docker, there's a Docker link. Otherwise, normally, I'm going to be showing you how to do it just the normal way, but I thought I'd mention the Docker version just in case you wanted to have it go. Okay, so what does a command look like? So for starters, if you've never used Python, oh, I should probably do a pen actually. This runs Python, and this tells you what file to run. Very simple. We then have U, and that's our URL, just like before. Very simple, but we don't have to tell it what to fuzz because it's going to find the parameters for us. We then have to give it a method. So in this case, we're doing post. If we're looking at, get method, we replace that with get. There's also JSON as an option as well. We output it to result.json. Once again, it's just easier to read. And with my fork, and only my fork, this will not work unless you use the link. You can also send it to Burp, and you'll see what that looks like and why that's not that useful. So let's have a look at it in action. Okay, so we're back. We've got Arjun open here, and we're just going to run, again, the command that I put in the slides. So we can see it's doing some heuristic checks here, and it's doing some kind of potential parameters. Just scroll up. We can see that we're just looking for non-existent parameters at the moment, and you can see as it kind of, I've lost it on the screen. It's doing some heuristic level checks. So this will take a little while. But because we're sending it to Burp, we can also see what it's doing via this. Oh yeah, this is one of the Arjun ones. We can see that it's just sent a ton of random stuff to the API endpoints. Okay, if we go here and we look at users, we can actually see it's hitting like a ton of these heuristic level checks. And we can see now it's just populating it. Now it's basically doing a bunch of different things and seeing what the response is. You know, whether or not it's responding differently. Like, for example, here we can see that we're violating some kind of constraints. So it's not necessarily useful to send this all to Burp, because as you can see, it's not very helpful. You have a lot of these, and it's done. And you just, it doesn't really tell you a lot. So we go to our output instead. That's data, edit, and we can see here we've got email, method, name, and password. So that tells us what the parameters are for this. And you can see it does it in a kind of weird way. You really don't need to send stuff to Burp to be able to find these parameters. It's probably not all that helpful. What you can do now is construct a request with this in, right? So now you know what these are. You can then go, okay, I'm gonna go send to a repeater here. Take these, because these are the ones I need. And put in some fake data here. And we can see whether or not it works. And as we can see, it's saying this is not supported for this route. So we might go in here and go, okay, method needs to be post. And then we can see that we've managed to do something. If we look back and say, okay, so what does all my API endpoints might do? This is our create. So we've created this new user. But yeah, so that's how we would use Arjun and how you would kind of act on Arjun's data. So let's go back and talk about how to analyze results. Okay, so let's first talk about Arjun's advantages and disadvantages. We can also send multiple URLs from our recon process and just let it run. Especially, you know, as we get, I'm only dealing with 3 because I didn't want to hack on a real website today because I was worried I might actually find something. So I'm using a custom API that I built. It's not very large. But actually when we deal with a real endpoint, we might be dealing with hundreds, right, of endpoints. A real target will be dealing with hundreds of endpoints. And it's quick. It's not like the quickest thing in the world, but it's definitely something we can just leave in the background and let run. The disadvantage is really we can't use other HTTP methods. However, we might get lucky and find underscore method like we did then, which allows, it's something provided by web apps that allows you to do a put method even though you're dealing with a post, which is quite cool. Okay, so now we've got the results. How do we actually analyze them? So I showed you a second ago how to do a little bit of this, but actually we might be dealing with hundreds of results. We will send a bunch of URLs over there and end up with the screenshot on the side there. The question is, how do we figure out if these are vulnerable? When we do this, the main bug we're looking for is really mass assignment or something acting a bit weird. Potentially IDORs, but really it's mass assignment. We're really looking to keep an eye out for IDORs to really increase bug severity. So here are 2 outputs that I've had. The first one has been my sort of first attempt where I just stuck a bunch of URLs in there and just waited and saw what came out. And the second one is where I've then realized, okay, we have the word method in here. Now I'm a web developer. I know that method allows you to access or to use a put or post request outside of the specific, like being able to write it. It just allows you to do it quite easily. And I'm seeing if I add method post over here, I'm then checking our update functionality, which is giving me this result here. So it's really about not just analyzing the results as in trying it and seeing if it works like I just did. It's also, okay, how do I go from this next? And that can be really difficult to figure out what you want to kind of accomplish. But once you understand it and you start playing with it, I think it's really going to help you more. So now we've talked about a bunch of theory, let's talk about practical hunting. So how would you practically do this? So I'm going to do a kind of short demo here. So I'll see you in a bit while I get it set up. Okay, so we're back at Burp now, and we're having a look at kind of our results. And as we're kind of seeing here, what we want to do is we want to actually hack this application. Now, the first thing we're seeing is when we go to up here and we resend it, we're then seeing, you know, some kind of class information, which is fine. There's no real risk in that. But actually, we were able to access grade here. And we might be thinking, you know, we have a user ID and we have a class ID. We could map that user to that class and figure out what their grade is. And I think that's really important to say, okay, that's definitely, you know, that's definitely dodgy, right? That doesn't sound right. That shouldn't work. So the first thing we're thinking is information disclosure. Done. The next thing we're thinking is, well, actually, you know, we will manage to find email, method, password, and we're actually able to create a new account over here. You know, what if we change this to put and the user to user ID 3? Or maybe user ID 6, because we know that's the IT guy. And we can see duplicate key values, unique constraint. So, okay, something's up here. You know, could I just change this to put? Oh, the email already exists. Oh, okay. So we just changed the email to something else. Perfect. Now, if we go back to here and we scroll down, we can see we're actually able to edit it. Classic idle. Done. We don't even need to log in to find the idle there. Now, I'm going to give people bonus methods, bonus points at the moment, if you can give me the method based on this login and that idle to get an account takeover, and how we can take over the IT guy's password. Attack. And we're probably going to find the same in grades, right? So we've already got idle, information disclosure. You know, if we kept on fuzzing, we might be able to find some user accounts and stuff like that. We're already seeing like the login over here. So could we make an account and log in? And sometimes you don't need to do complex recon. Sometimes you need to go look, we can now register an account and log in as something, right? So sometimes it's really quite straightforward. Oh, it's going to be like, generate one for me, please. 11111. And now we can log in. And that doesn't really give us any more options, but we sort of got, like, we've at least got something there. We might be seeing, you know, register, what does it take, what is it doing? One big thing is now that we're logged in and we hit an API endpoint, it's going to also send cookies now. So what we might have had before is kind of an authentication idle where you don't have to be logged in at all versus one where you have to be logged in but you can still access someone else's stuff. So that's kind of how you would do that practically. It's a lot more similar to how you would hack normally. It's just getting that larger scope and hitting those endpoints that you wouldn't necessarily have found otherwise. Because all we saw at the start was this page with a made by and a login functionality, right? So we're really it's really useful to be able to do recon and then also find bugs. So I'm going to put you back to the slides, do a little intro, outro, and then that's it. So I hope you found that really useful. I know it was a long one. I know it was a bit tedious, but I really hope that it's taught you a little bit about how to do API enumeration, and hopefully you'll be hacking this weekend. I know I'm gonna be out there, learning how to use FFUF even more, and I hope that this video and the previous video have really helped you kind of get more comfortable with the idea of API hacking. There are so many bugs that just haven't been found in APIs, and you don't need to be like super smart to be able to find them. They're just there. They're low-hanging fruits. So I want to also thank Integrity for sponsoring this video. If you've got to the end, thank you. You can access and register with Integrity using my link, go.integrity.com/Katie. It's in the description. You can just click on it. If you find your first bug there, let me know. I want to celebrate your success. People have already told me they found their first bug on Integrity, so actually it's super exciting to be able to help people find their first bug, or help people find even more bugs. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.